Hello, everyone. Hi, everyone. We're just letting people in. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are joining us this afternoon. My name is Sarine Karageorgian. I'm the Program Director of the Environmental Politics Program at the Arab Reform Initiative. Today's discussion and panel discussion will be entitled Documenting the Impact of Armed Conflicts on the Environment in the Middle East, Filling the Gaps. And today's webinar is jointly organized with our partners and colleagues from the Robert Bosch Stiftung and Orient Matters. All over the Middle East, conflicts are having disastrous effects on the environmental stability and by extension on human livelihood. Entire ecosystems have been destroyed by bombings and the regular use of chemical weapons. Water reserves meant to satiate entire communities have been rendered unfit for human consumption. Agricultural yields have fallen to unsustainable levels, and military priorities have eradicated millennia-old forests. Due to the thick fog of war, it has become quasi-impossible to properly and adequately assess the extent of the damage, and the pressing state of humanitarian and political dynamics in post-conflict societies have made it very difficult to understand how the environment factors reconstruction efforts. West Asia and North Africa are the regions of the world that are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and they have both gone through multiple conflicts in the past 20 years, namely in Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Yemen, Sudan, and Libya. Each of those conflicts have had a tremendously large impact on their respective environment, and we today still struggle to understand to what extent of these conflicts have damaged and have affected on the population's everyday life. In Yemen, for example, relentless bombing campaigns have left more than 15 million people without proper access to clean drinking water and safe sanitation. The destruction of waste management facilities have caused a waste crisis, and this massive pollution has caused a cholera epidemic. This has also exacerbated water shortages. In Iraq, another example, an entire generation has never known a life free of due to environmental chemicals and enriched uranium weapons used by the American forces during the Gulf Wars. Cancer rates are at all-time high in the heavily affected southern governorates, which include Basra, a city plagued by severe levels of water and air pollutions caused by decades of war-induced mismanagement. Recently, Basra was plagued by a cholera outbreak, partly due to the construction or the deconstruction of water treatment facility. Hence, there is an urgent need to interpret and analyze how conflict and how armed conflicts have led to this, and what role the international community can play in addressing this situation. Environmental destruction has many of the hallmarks we today associate with war crimes, meaning that a case could be made that they ought to be investigated as such. So today's webinar will highlight some of the initiatives and efforts to document the impact of armed conflicts on the environment in the Arab region, and the challenges that these initiatives encounter, and how environmental priorities can be better integrated in post-conflict planning. We are joined today by 3 speakers from the region and also from the international era. Our first speaker will be Yunus Abu. Yunus is a senior United Nations official with a long experience in conflict resolution, peace building, governance, and sustainable development. He previously worked as the director of the political office of the UN Under Secretary General for Conflict Prevention. He was also a senior political advisor to the UN Secretary General, Special Envoy to Burundi. He directed the political office of the UN Secretary General, Special Envoy to Yemen, and acted as his senior special advisor. Among several other positions with the United Nations, Yunus was also the senior political officer in charge of the regional affairs in the UN political mission to Libya, and senior regional expert in the UN Security Council panel of experts on Sudan, specifically Darfur. Our second speaker is Natasha Karmi. Natasha is a lead water specialist at the Geneva Water Hub, which she joined in 2018. There, she works on developing platforms for hydropolitical cooperation and facilitation. She organizes roundtable discussions and expert meetings on the link between water and peace, and prepares and delivers the role play of the annually held summer course on hydrodiplomacy offered by the University of Geneva. Before joining the Geneva Water Hub, she was a policy advisor on water and environment at the United Nations Development Programme for 9 consecutive years. And from 2002 to 2008, she worked at the Palestinian Hydrology Group as a senior management assistant. Our last speaker is Wim Zwijnenberg, is a humanitarian disarmament project leader for PAX. He works on conflict and environment-related issues in the Middle East and the use of proliferation of emerging military technologies and arms trade. Just a logistical issue, we have both languages and simultaneous interpretation. أهلا وسهلا جميعا يلي انضموا إلينا بعد الظهر. في ترجمة فورية رح تكون معنا من اللغة الإنجليزية للغة العربية، فإذا فيكم من تحت الشاشة على اليمين تكبسوا على الانتربريتيشن button. So we will have also a poll that will be launched by our colleague in the Arab Reform, Andrew, if you may. This is 4 questions for us to know who you are and where you're coming from, and how do you see conflict in the region. We'll give 30 seconds. Okay, thank you. So thank you for the poll. We will then discuss about the results at the end when the speakers will finalize their interventions. Each speaker, you have around 5 to 8 minutes, and then we will open up for questions. But just to keep in mind our main 3 questions for this panel. One is, how has armed conflict impacted the environment, and how is environmental degradation contributing to conflict? 2, how can and should humanitarian efforts, reconstruction initiatives, peace building and transitional justice integrate environmental considerations? And 3, what role can environmental activists and advocates play in peace building? Yunus, the floor is yours. Tfaddal. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sareen, and thank you to the Arab Reform Initiative for organizing this timely discussion. And more now we hear for the last few years the phrase of climate wars, climate conflict as a phrase that is being widely used and has become widely known recently. And I would say that this phrase depicts more and more a chaotic world with unsustainable livelihood, mass migrations, devastating weather-related disaster, violent clashes basically for survival, because it's an issue of competition for resources that are rapidly diminishing. So when I use conflict here, I mean, of course, violent conflict, because conflict, not being violent, is part of human life and human history. So we cannot really get rid of it. But violent conflict is the issue that is plaguing more and more many parts of the world. And I believe that it's an overdetermined phenomenon. We cannot say that environmental degradation or global warming is the main factor behind violent conflict, but it is becoming one of the main drivers. But traditionally, among the main drivers of conflict, we would all agree that it's about injustice, socioeconomic injustice, political marginalization, inequality, which is an issue that is increasing more and more during the few years, poor governance, which is a major issue, especially in the Western Asia, North Africa region. And as I said, increasingly environmental degradation that has become an important driver of conflict, especially in fragile and vulnerable settings. So I would say that to answer the first question of yours, that environmental degradation is a risk multiplier. It worsens conditions that are already prone to the rise of violent conflict. As I said earlier, poverty, inequality, and poor governance. And there are many researchers and experiences around the world that shows the adverse climate conditions, environmental degradation can lead to more support for increased violent conflicts. And these conditions can escalate or prolong violence. And this is particularly the case, unfortunately, in places that are already marked by fragility, I mean, institutional, socioeconomic, and political fragility, but also climate-sensitive areas. Typically, the hotspots, as we all know, such dynamics are found more and more now in the Sahel and the rural areas in Africa. And here, I would speak briefly about Darfur. We can have a more in-depth discussion if you want later on in the Q&A. But Darfur, for instance, when the conflict started back in early 2000, mid-2000, the conflict was depicted as always, unfortunately, when it concerns Africa, as an issue that is an ethnic problem between tribal group, between Africans and Arabs. But actually, the complexity of that conflict is much more than meets the eye. If briefly, I mean, if we look at the geography of Darfur, the north has mostly camel herders, which are mostly from Arab ethnic background with other tribes. And the center of Darfur is mostly made of 4 tribes and Zaghawa and other tribes that are mostly farmers. And then the south of Darfur is also composed of farmers from different ethnic backgrounds, including also Arab farmers. So when the problem started, it started between the Arab nomads from the north and the other tribes in the center, in the full region, because traditionally, and the camel herders had an agreement with the farmers that they could graze in their lands during a certain part of the season, and then they have to return back north. But unfortunately, during the drought season and the problems that Eastern Africa has suffered from, in Sudan particularly in the 80s, more and more these camel herders started going into the grazing lands off season and deeper, destroying the crops of the farmers. This was one of the main triggers of the conflict. Plus, also the nomads realized through time that they don't want to live like nomads anymore. Things have changed, life has changed. They wanted to settle down, to have their kids go to school, to live a modern life, and this clashed with the farmers who saw this continued incursion in their lands as a destruction of their livelihood. So, having framed that conflict as an ethnic one, it was very simplistic, because when you look at the Arab farmers from the south, they did not join that conflict. They were not part of it. They were not against the Fur or the Zaghawa tribes. And the conflict really was between the northern cattle herders or camel herders and the farmers. Unfortunately, as you know, when a conflict starts and becomes protracted over the years, people forget why they started the fighting in the first place. And the dynamic creates new reasons and new triggers, to the extent that a decade or almost 2 decades after the conflict started, now people are fighting for other reasons. So we should not forget that the climate and environmental part or reason behind conflicts, and especially the one in Darfur, is extremely important. And of course, this issue of environment shapes peace and security outcomes, and these outcomes depends on how societies respond to this environmental degradation and climate change consequences. Unfortunately, in the case of Darfur, because of the institutional setup in Sudan, the response was not a good one, and it made the conflict more complex and more difficult to resolve. I argue here that the issue is the way you framed the two questions. It is actually a vicious circle. It's the environmental degradation contributing to conflict, and conflict in its turn, armed conflict affects environment. So it's very hard to break that vicious circle. And here I'll go to the second part of your question, and I would say that armed conflict, of course, negatively affects economic activity and livelihoods wherever it breaks out. It threatens food security. It obstructs markets and public good provision. It damages critical infrastructure, like water, sanitation, as you said earlier in your introduction. And most of all, it triggers forced displacements. And we've seen the huge numbers of IDPs and climate refugees now in Western Asia and Africa, more and more. And unfortunately, things are not going to change positively in the near future. Actually, I'm afraid that it's getting worse. So all of these erode local capacity to cope and adapt to these environmental hazards. In fact, violent conflict in the context of a global climate crisis, a deepening environmental crisis around the world, plays a far more prominent role than we expected earlier. It is becoming a critical driver of vulnerability, which makes adverse impacts from weather extremes more likely and more severe in their consequences. In other words, violent conflicts weakens these communities and countries so that they are not in a position to adapt to the changing world around them. And here I would like to give an example about Libya. Libya is an interesting country. It is known to be wealthy in the sense that it's an oil-producing country. But we should not forget that there are other economic activities in the country that have produced revenues for people, especially farming, even though it's not widely spread as other countries in North Africa. So productive and sustainable farming is, as we all know, is one of the most powerful tools to end extreme poverty. But unfortunately, violent conflict erodes these efforts. And in the case of Libya, it has eroded severely the farming sector, because conflict forced many farmers to flee their homes and abandon their farms. Already a large part of Libya is desert, and another part is rugged terrain in the mountains, which makes it already complex to develop agriculture. And it's almost unviable for farmers to dig wells. So while the only water tanks farmers used to depend on for emergencies in dry season were destroyed, and the water supply severely hampered during the fierce fighting that started basically since the post-conflict period. And many farmers today in Libya cannot afford to buy water for their farms and houses, as it is too expensive. And then we add to this the drought and increased effect of global warming that is hitting North Africa. It just makes things unsustainable. So the environmental degradation and conflict are subjecting Libya to extreme climate events, which Libya suffers from severe sand and dust storms, droughts, and increased temperatures. And the years of protracted conflict have weakened the country's resilience and capacity to adapt to this situation. As I said earlier, Libya is a country of primarily desert lands. Actually, under 2% of land is arable in that country. So if you imagine with the complicating factor of conflict, even that small portion of land that was arable is now not producing food for the population, which means that food security is becoming more and more of a problem for Libya. Hundreds of farmers have actually decided to leave this sector and just move to cities because it's more viable for them to try to find a job in the city than stay in a situation of unsustainable livelihood. At the global level, Libya is already classified as among the countries less prepared to environmental hazard. And this conflict that has been waging now since 2011 has left the country even more vulnerable to environmental degradation and climate vulnerability. Water has become a major issue, and it will become even more so in the future, and it will increase the impacts of natural hazards on agricultural production. The World Bank and the UN have issued many reports on this situation, and the limited renewable water resources, coupled with drought and poor soil, have been severely limiting production and forcing the country to import almost 90% of the food required to meet local needs. So as you know, this is not a sustainable situation. These are basically for the two first questions and the vicious circle between climate, environmental degradation and conflict, and vice versa. I will leave the third question to the next round so I don't go beyond the 7 minutes that were allocated to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Yunus, for your stimulating and very comprehensive, intervention around Libya, and also you touched upon the food and access to water. So maybe we'll go to Natasha, who also has extensive experience on water. And Natasha, tfadali, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sareen, and thank you for the Arab Reform Initiative for holding this webinar. I fully agree with Yunus that this is really a timely webinar. I was just telling Sareen and her colleagues before we started that most recently, two weeks ago, more than 80 states have actually signed a political declaration on the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And this is, the first international agreement that aims to limit the use of weapons with wide area effects in towns and cities. So it is really timely. And thank you, for inviting us also to take part in this webinar. I will take a different approach, than the one that Yunus has taken. And as a water specialist, working for the Geneva Water Hub, which is a science diplomacy center specialized in water for peace, my interventions will be more focused on water in armed conflict, the protection of water infrastructure, the reverberating effects, and the need for global platforms. At the Geneva Water Hub, we work on the intersection of three main global agendas: the development, the humanitarian, and the peace building. And in line with the remarks that were made by the United Nations Secretary General upon taking oath to the General Assembly, where he said that humanitarian response, sustainable development, and sustaining peace are three sides of the same triangle. We at the Geneva Water Hub believe that water is at the core of this triangle. So our approach towards peace building, our approach towards water issues, to the impacts are really stemming from a reflection of taking into consideration the intersection of these three agendas. And for the next 5 minutes, I would like to share with you our work as it relates to the topic of this webinar. And I hope that the vehicles and the instruments that we use could be helpful. So kindly allow me just to give you a very bit of a background on how our work has been initiated. In 2015, 15 co-convening countries, including Switzerland, launched the Global High-Level Panel on Water and Peace, whose mandate was actually to facilitate the use of water as an important factor of building peace and to enhance the relevance of water issues in national and global policy making. 2 years later, and in 2017, the panel produced a report, A Matter of Survival, in which it made recommendations on how to strengthen the global framework to prevent and resolve water-related conflict. The report included several chapters, and the one that is of interest to this webinar is Chapter 2, which was on water in armed conflict. The chapter concluded with a number of recommendations, some of which were directed towards the UN Security Council. And since 2017, several discussions and debates have taken place. Part of the debate relates to the question of protection of water and interrelated infrastructure in armed conflict. The Geneva Water Hub, as the secretariat to the panel, oversees the implementation of most of those recommendations. And in responding to the panel recommendation to strengthen respect for and implementation of international humanitarian law, particularly as it relates to water, and in an attempt to clarify that IHL principles, such as the principles of distinction and proportionality, must be applied both in international and non-international armed conflicts, we have collaborated with other academic partners, international and non-governmental organizations, to prepare the Geneva List of Principles on the protection of water infrastructure during and after armed conflict. Now, this document provides the first ever systemic compendium of all existing principles and rules with regard to the protection of water in the conduct of hostilities and post-conflict situations, including international humanitarian law, human rights law, international water law, and international environmental law. It is a document that is destined to both state and non-state actors, and it aims to improve the protection of civilians who are most affected by the violations of international norms, protecting water infrastructures and water resources during armed conflict. So how is this useful, and how do we build upon the Geneva List? It is useful as a reference document, which could also be incorporated into military manuals, and it opens up the dialogue. Another important follow-up is the monitoring. For us, the next step would be to conduct in-depth case studies which would review accountability mechanisms. And these case studies are also expected to explore the reverberating effects of the impacts of attacks, notably in terms of people's livelihoods or health. This leads me to my second point, the reverberating effects of damage to water and wastewater systems. And here I would like to refer you to the in-depth work of my colleague, Dr. Mark Zaytoun, who I'm gladly is joining us today also in the webinar, and also Michael Telhami, who have looked at urban services and the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. We all know that in armed conflicts, water is both a tool and a victim, and that the impact of attacks on water infrastructure could be either direct or indirect. But the important thing is that they are accumulative and they will reverberate over time and space. It is also important to understand that when we talk about water services under armed conflict, they are more than just that infrastructure. They also include the consumables and the people. Nevertheless, the impacts can reverberate long well beyond the attack zone and long after the attack occurs. It is essential and vital to understand and to be able to document these reasonably foreseeable impacts, as they can also be preventable. Yusuf has mentioned the issue of resilience, and it is related to governance. And it is true that the resilience of the water services are actually a function of their conditions prior to the conflict situations. So within that context, we are not only talking about water quantity, but also of water quality. And whenever we talk about water quality, then we are touching upon the impact on public health. Again, for case studies, specific case studies, I would encourage you to read the article by Talhami and Zaytoun on the impact of attacks on urban services in the International Review of the Red Cross, in which they reviewed public domain literature on Iraq, Yemen, and Gaza to gauge the extent of confidence in information about this attack, water, wastewater, infectious disease chain. My final point is on the need for global spaces for agency. Sareen had asked us in our bilateral preparations about kinds of international spaces and platforms for joint work. In the panel report, the Global High-Level Panel on Water and Peace, the panelists were actually confronted with a gap in international cooperation beyond the technical water management, and hence a lack of agency. Therefore, the panel made the recommendation to establish the Global Observatory on Water and Peace as a global platform. We at the Geneva Water Hub with our partners have launched the Global Observatory in 2018 as a network of regional organizations and societal entities that are dedicated to work for water for peace. Currently, there are 10 partners who collaborate to generate and act through new mechanisms for water diplomacy. We meet, we discuss, we brainstorm on out-of-the-box thinking and wide-ranging policy to tackle increasingly complex challenges in creative ways. This is a space in which local voices, youth, women, media, as well as think tanks and policymaking entities come together and voice their reflections and share their experiences. These are the kinds of spaces in which there is room for joint work and impact. I will stop here and hopefully I'll be able to answer the other questions. Back to you, Sareen.
Thank you so much, Natasha, as well, for reminding us of the different spaces and forum that youth and advocates can actually use to push for an policy change if possible. Joining us, I will go back to Wim, who will take us to usage of technological tools, GIS models, and what are the challenges as well on the ground that you are facing with advocates. Wim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for having me talk today about this subject of conflict and environment. Before I'll start, I'd make sure that everything works here properly. Good afternoon, and thanks everyone for joining, and thanks for the Arab Reform Initiative for hosting us. And today I'm going to talk a bit about the work PAX is doing on conflict and environment during the period we've been working on this topic, why we're working on environmental issues as a peace organization. I give you some of their examples, in particular focusing on Syria, and in the end I'll explain a little bit on why this work is helping policies on environmental recovery and highlighting the strengthening of norms for protection of the environment in relation of armed conflict throughout the UN agenda, both on a legal and a political and a policy level. Just as a starter, we started working as PAX on environmental issues in conflict in Iraq. Our partners in Basra were concerned around the environmental legacy of the multiple invasions and the wars in Iraq itself, and the impact it could have on health and ecosystems. And from there on, in 2010, 2011, we started to explore how to address these issues. And one of the main top problems we ran into is that the environment was often considered as a low priority because it's less visible what the impacts are, in particular around health problems, which are very difficult to directly link with conflict sources in many occasions, or it takes time for those conflict impacts to manifest themselves through like what's called slow violence, the building up of pollution in the environment from a range of what we call toxic remnants of war. And when the revolution in Syria turned out into full conflict, we started monitoring there. At the same time, we were still lacking back then the sufficient tools to document what's happening in conflict, because often there was no access in conflicts because of security reasons. There was limited information coming out, but because of the internet and because of the rise of public resources, of access to data, to satellite imagery, there was a range of methods we could apply to visualize what's happening in conflicts and go more into detail on what exactly the environmental impacts are, from acute impacts to long-term implications. So at the same time, I started also working as a volunteer for Bellingcat, which is an open source research collective, which did amazing work on a range of topics, including on Syria, and documenting what's happening around barrel bombings, etc. And they developed a sort of toolkit on what kind of open source information can be used to track, in this case, wartime impacts. And for us, from in particular in the work I was doing, I was making a lot of use of social media to look at what's happening on the front lines and what's happening post-conflict or in the conflict situations in the conflict-affected countries, using open source satellite imagery, images we could take from social media on fighting, like the impacts on factories and industrial zones. So here I have a couple of examples here of, like, we were tracking in 2018, there was a large outbreak of wildfires, which were partly linked with ISIS activities in Iraq. And that you see public images like satellite imagery on the bottom of the page, which was very helpful to quantify the impact, like to show how much land was affected. So and quantifying it helps also getting attention from journalists, from policymakers, from journalists to visualize what the impact is, for policymakers to show how much land was affected, how many farmers were affected by the wildfires directly or long term. And on the other bottom, you see a report that we did on Banias, which is on Syria's coast. And it's a thermal power plant and also a refinery where there was a lot of offloading from oil being brought in from Iran. But also because of the conflict, there was lack of maintenance of the refinery, so there were a lot of leakages. There were attacks on underwater pipelines, which caused a lot of coastal pollution. And through open source satellite imagery, we were monitoring all these spills and then build up a sort of pattern to show, like, how much pollution was on this coastal line from the area. And that's very helpful to show. And then eventually there was a big breakdown last year. One of the major heavy fuel stations, which polluted the whole coast around this area, and the oil spills reached all the way up to Turkey and Cyprus. So it's just one example, a couple of examples of how open source data can be helpful to visualize and quantify these impacts. Now, moving on to Syria. I'm just going to go into a couple of examples in Syria. There are many issues around the environmental impacts of the conflict, which can be found in our reports, which you can find on our websites. I just go into, like, 3 specific details. We did a lot of work over the last couple of years on documenting the environmental impacts in northeast Syria, in particular around the oil refineries, which was one of the major unique features in the Syrian conflict when it comes to environmental impacts, because the destruction of Syria's oil industry in the beginning, like, the refineries were taken over by armed groups. Later, ISIS used the oil extraction for funding them. And of course, the US-led coalition started bombing these refineries. Russia started bombing them as well. And there was already a widespread surge of so-called makeshift refineries, which was spread over the whole northeast region and also in the northwest. A lot of people, particularly civilians, were working in these makeshift refineries, being exposed to hazardous substances, like oil waste was dumped. Most of those were shut down in 2017 in the SDF-controlled areas. But, like, there were still, like, a lot of issues around the professional refineries dumping oil waste into rivers, oil smuggling. So here, for example, in the background, you see an operation by the SDF against oil smugglers in Deir ez-Zor, where they set on fire all these oil boats, which was used to transfer oil from the SDF area to the regime area by smugglers. And this is, like, a big issue with impact on the Euphrates River. because also and we'll talk about it later, like lowering water levels makes it more susceptible to all kinds of pollution being dumped into the river. We also seen recently renewed attacks by Turkey also on the oil infrastructure in northeast Syria, which also is impacting access to fuel, in particular in winter for households and gas as well. So this has been a major issue throughout the conflict in Syria and Deir ez-Zor, but also in Aleppo, we have similar issues around makeshift refineries, and also the lack of the ability for the autonomous administration to import the necessary capacities for maintenance and repairs of the existing oil infrastructure, leading to more incidents, and there have been some massive incidents of oil pollution in that area as well. It's all very complicated because of political issues, the pressure of Turkey, the imposing of the sanctions, which limits imports, and the lack of a clear political resolution for the status of northeast Syria. At the same time, you see in the regime area similar issues as well, the breakdown of infrastructure, but also leads to something else, which I'm going to talk about next, is deforestation. So PAX is about to release a major report where we looked at the forest loss throughout the conflict in Syria. And the findings are quite shocking, in particular in the west of Syria, where the increase of fuel prices led to a lot of forest deforestation, in particular in Idlib, Aleppo, Tartus, and Latakia. In the period 2015, there was a rapid increase. In total, you see clearly over 30%, I think close to 40% forest loss in the whole of Syria. So Syria, 3% of the land cover in Syria is covered by forests, in particular in the west and northwest, and that's all been lost throughout the conflict. Of course, like it's difficult. It's like civilians need access to fuel. They can't afford it anymore, but also armed groups take advantage of it, start cutting down forests, which has an impact on like the carbon sinks. It has an impact in particular dealing with the climate crisis, which is heating up land, and in general the degradation of soils. We've seen the loss of with posing more risk to for example, in areas where there are a lot of IDP camps set up also in commercial area, in commercial forests. And it's not to blame people. It's very understandable to people that this is happening and people are cutting down trees. But there are also long-term implications, and there are risks involved with that. And that's why using a remote sensing and monitoring is helpful to document what's happening, to anticipate on these impacts, and to prepare for and ensure that the response programs include this kind of ecological dimensions into their work. And visualizing that and doing the remote sensor work can be very helpful. There will be more examples of other areas in Syria in the report. We go into areas in Aleppo. We go dive into issues around deforestation in Palmyra and some other topics as well. But just to highlight some of the issues and how it's helpful to visualize these kind of impacts. And here's one example from like forest loss in Kafr Aleppo, an area in the south of Aleppo city. So you can see how the forest impacted, how deforestation impacted this for people who are looking for firewood or for heating, for cooking. Lastly, because I only have like a few minutes, looking a bit more at water and the climate impacts in 2020. We traveled 2021 to northeast Syria. There were there's a lot of exploration already on how the drought and water shortages, in particular linked with lack of rainfall in northeast Syria itself, but also the water flow in the Euphrates impacted farmers. And it's been very well documented. And we wanted to look a bit more into how it impacted pastoralists. There are a lot of pastoralists moving around with large amounts of cattle. And of course, the lack of rain has impacted vegetation growth and also forcing people more to other areas. Could it create more tensions between existing farming communities and cattle communities? Well, there are other major issues with water sources in northeast Syria itself. And also thanks to Geneva Water Help for helping us with some of the research we did there. So here, for example, you see, like what I mentioned earlier, the Lake Assad has lowering water levels, and it's being used for irrigation. In the north, in 2021, Turkey-backed Syrian National Army groups blocked the Khabur River from the water flow going down, which affected downstream communities for having access to water. In the northeast, in the Rumelan oil fields, there's a lot of problems with oil waste that the self-administration's oil companies are dumping into the water because they don't have water filtration plants or dealing with oil waste. So it's directly dumped into creeks and rivers going down the Jagjak River, the Khabur, all the way to the Hasaka Reservoir. That's only getting worse with lowering water levels as well. So you don't have any more dilution, which could sort of limit these impacts. And in the south, like also the reduction of water flow is impacting lack of pumping for irrigation systems. So just to give a quick overview and a visualization how water in from different views is impacting the land there. So to move on to this, like what can be done with this? So as I mentioned, like, yeah, it's not been a priority, and it's understandably not a priority in humanitarian work because it's focused on saving lives. But more and more there is a recognition that environmental degradation also has an impact on lives. We can see it, we can quantify it, we can show the pathways of exposure people to a range of issues that's impacting their lives and livelihoods. So we can have that more recognized in the response work. In the past, there was a lot of top-down schemes, like decisions being made, short-time funding made available to directly solve these issues on the ground. But we have to do more long-term planning to address environmental work with environmental action on the ground, because it's directly linked with livelihoods and public health of people. As I mentioned, through these monitoring work, we can clearly create more understanding of what the environmental impacts are on people's lives and implication, and that can be translated into policies to respond. Unfortunately, the colleague from Yemen couldn't join today, but to give you one example, this summer, there were major issues with leaking oil tankers in the port of Aden, which have been there since 2015. Nobody was taking responsibility for cleaning up those oil tankers. We use satellite imagery to monitor again, like the spills coming from these tankers throughout a certain period. Published about that, worked with journalists about this. Then it was picked up by the UNDP. Now funds being made available to find a solution and remove these oil tankers. There's just one thing, like one example where it can trickle down. And lastly, like it's very clear to have more the need for local communities to be involved in that debate, and we work a lot together with our partners in Northeast Syria, and it's been very helpful to highlight these issues, what they've come across, because what we see is not always directly what they experience as a priority. I think I'm running short on time. And lastly, what we want to do with this, like it's clear we want to, this is the broader discussion at the moment is how we can translate these kind of examples into UN policies in response, in nation state policies on how to improve military guidelines on protection of the environment in armed conflict, how to both for the military, but also do the legal framework, which is now being discussed in the UN. I already gave the example of data collection, so I won't go into that. Afterwards, like how to ensure environmental work is included into post-conflict reconstruction work. And that's in the end helps also setting the norms on protection of the environment and in relation to armed conflict throughout this whole sort of cycle of conflict, as you've seen it here. And yeah, I'll leave it at that, but hopefully we can discuss a bit more in detail later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wim. Thank you so much for this presentation, and also the many different challenges that you are also facing on the ground when you're talking to advocates. And I think we will definitely go back to these questions with the audience. We had a fourth speaker, Hadil Muwafaq, who apologized for health reasons. She will not be with us, but we can definitely take questions from the audience. If anyone has any questions, you can just enter it in the chat bottom. And now maybe with Andrew, we can see the results of the poll. Andrew? Okay, just reading out loud a bit. What is your field of work? So around 63% are in research think tanks, 10% in business, 10% in diplomacy, 3% journalism, 13% in academia. Second question, what region do you come from? So we have the highest West Asia, but also Western Europe, 43%, North America, 10%, no one from Sub-Saharan Africa, but North Africa, 7% as well, South America, 3%. Third question, how well informed do you feel about issues of conflict and environment? So 53% adequately informed, 30% very well informed, 17% not well informed. Hopefully after this webinar, we'll have more people informed and we continue this discussion. Where do you receive most of your information from? The highest is international newspapers, 26% from peer-reviewed journals, and social media, 26%. Okay, it's interesting to see the different types of people in the room and how we get information and how we need to also improve the way we communicate. And I think this is something you also mentioned, Wim and Younes and Natasha, how we communicate and document these conflicts to the larger audience, if we can say. There is one question actually from Romy, and we'll read it out loud. How can we explain to big international NGOs that human response should come in priority first, like don't expect them to use bins for recycling when they don't have water shortages or water storage, and that sometimes the solution is not by providing food and clothes, but what they need in order to cook and clean. So how can international NGOs shift from linear to circular economic aids? Maybe Younes, you want to respond to this question?
Yes, sure. Well, I think the issue of response should not be an individualistic one. This is a collective problem. Collective problems need collective solutions. Of course, I'm not saying that it is not important for people to change the way they behave, especially that now we, as I said earlier, the whole world is going through a major global environmental crisis that threatens basically humanity, life on Earth. But I think it's a systemic problem. And we have to look at the way socioeconomic and the political dimensions of this whole issue and the way we deal with it. I think it is time we reconsidered our development paradigm, our international governance system, and seriously take actions that will not only deal with issues of resilience, but actually change the path. Because if we keep going down this path, no individual action will help us go through this. So yes, for individual behavior to change, but it is not enough. It is about structural issues that has to be dealt with nationally and most of all internationally. And I think this is the way to go.
Okay, thank you, Younes. Wim, maybe we can talk about how do you build these international and change these international versus regional boundaries, as we call it. Wim, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, first on the question that was asked, I think there's also a lot of progress being made in the humanitarian response work on the environmental issues. So there's the Environmental Emergencies Forum, which brings together all these humanitarian groups, including environmental experts on how to deal with this kind of challenges that were asked as well. So we've seen, for example, in a lot of IDP and refugee camps where there's access to clean energy because there was. You see, for example, with heating, with traditional heating, like fires, etc., it created a lot of air pollution in tents, and which affected people. So that's one part where you see improvements being made. It's being recognized, and donors are investing in that. And similarly, in the operations itself, there are like really good discussions going on now. For example, even peacekeeping operations and the environmental footprint of those operations. I think in general, there's like a lot of investment in more sustainable technologies and responses in this kind of situations where humanitarians are operating to limit both their footprint, but also prevent people from being exposed to all kinds of toxic remnants of war, like in particular the communities they're supporting, and also to look for improvements and make that sort of part of their work. So I think there's a lot of positive progress there.
Thank you, Wim. Natasha?
I'm just rereading the question, and I was thinking, I might not be able to respond, from the humanitarian perspective, but rereading the question, I was wondering, why is it just the responsibility, of the humanitarian sector? And I think I agree with Younes that the change is global, and with the current polycrisis era that we're living through, it is imperative basically to have a new way of thinking in which we are looking at our collective responsibility, but we're also looking at how actors both within the different agendas, the development, the humanitarian, and the peace building, could look at the problem collectively and have a solution. And I think that there's also a role, for the local communities, and the value of the work, that PAX is doing and others. I think that it is providing a knowledge base, it's providing evidence, but it's also important to raise awareness, among the local communities. So while, like Wim said, it's fully understandable why people are deforesting for their personal uses, I think that it's also important to understand what are the consequences of this on the environment. So I do think that it's not just the responsibility, of a particular sector or a group of people. So it's not just the international NGOs. It has to be really a collective approach to changing the way that we think and we approach this.
Okay, thank you, Natasha. We have two more questions, but also related to the data. Maybe this is another. There's a lot of, from the poll that we have seen, a lot of data and information is coming from Western international newspapers. So how can we create more local, regional data and knowledge, producing more knowledge from the region on capturing conflict and the impact of conflict on the environment? And this is maybe one question. The second, I'll read it as well, is from Maria. Are there risks in the reliance on big data? Example, like you mentioned, the remote sensing. Conflicts are inherently social, political / cultural phenomena, but remote sensing, for example, is quite unable to map out these factors. Should this data then just come as a first step? How to avoid overlooking these factors in our analysis of the generated data? We'll take this question and then we'll go back to the third one. Maybe Wim, if you want to answer this question.
Yeah, sure. No, it's a very good one. And I think because that's so the reason why we used remote sensing a bit more and open source investigation is 10 years ago, there was only like UN Environment was doing post-conflict environmental assessments, and only if they had funding or if they had then they needed a mandate as well. Because we had lack of information what's happening during the conflict, nobody was actually monitoring it during the conflict. So the data made it possible. That doesn't mean the data captures everything. There are a lot of the gaps in data because it totally depends, for example, on the area where you work in. So if you have like an area with a lot of cloud cover, for example, in Central Africa, Central America, or in winter in other areas, you can't always track what's happening. However, what we're trying to do is to show we at least we can, with remote sensing and with open source environmental investigation, we can add a bit more than we used to know. It's not complete, but it's at least more than we used to know before. And it still needs on the ground verification. That's one of the reasons why we always travel to conflict areas and we work with partners in conflict affected areas, also to avoid having a narrow focus from our own perspective. To give you one example from Northeast Syria, it was very easy to detect oil pollution from remote sensing and to detect what's happening. But we talked with local partners, with local governance. They said, like, yeah, they admit it's an issue, but like the bigger issue at the moment is solid waste management, because we have air pollution from burning of there's now waste processing, so people are burning solid waste, which is much more closer to populated areas, to towns and villages, creating more health implications for people. That was a bigger concern to them. So that's something I couldn't necessarily pick up with remote sensing. And that continues to be needed to do ground verification. We're now setting up a couple of workshops with partners in Syria and Iraq to train them how to use remote sensing, and they combine it with on-the-ground monitoring of data on various issues where they can use it themselves. It's all relatively easy, and it's important to make these kind of tools and methodology accessible for people. It's out there on the internet. There are a lot of platforms people can use, data sets people can use, and it's becoming more and more easier for people to use them. So that also strengthens their own capacity. They're not reliant on us anymore, and to do this because we're sitting in a safe environment and we have the time to do this, but like it's accessible to them as well. So that's one of the things. I hope that answers the question a little bit. So it's a start, and it's not the answer, the final answer, but it's at least a beginning of another piece of the puzzle that at least helps highlight to these issues in a better way and visualize it, and at the same time they can use it themselves.
Yes, thank you, Wim. I think there are two more questions, and these are for the three of you, the three panelists. One is from Stefan. As protection of the environment is increasingly understood as part of the protection of civilians' agenda, what are the implications for local and international organizations working in the protection cluster? Would they benefit from clarified international legal standards and guidance on this issue, for example, the UN and ICRC? Here, maybe Yunus, you can answer this question. Natasha, of course. And the last question from Ali, in monitoring and evaluation processes, what are the indicators that can be used to measure the environmental impact on peace? Yunus, probably you would like to go back to this protection of civilians.
Well, this issue has been now on the agenda of the United Nations and international community for a while. I mean, there are many fora now. You have the UN Climate Security Mechanism. UN Development Program has developed a series of plans to climate-proof peacekeeping and stability in regions that have experienced conflict. The issue of environment, climate, and security nexus has been the subject of more than 9 open debates at the United Nations Security Council since 2007. So this is part of now. It's the international community realizes that this is a major issue that has to be dealt with, and there is more and more realization that the work on peace building cannot be acted upon in a silo mentality, separated from issues of development, environment, and humanitarian. That's why now more and more the UN with its different agencies and branches works on the principle of what we call the triple nexus, which combines humanitarian action, development, sustainable development, and peace building. Because you cannot resolve these issues of peacemaking by working only at the political level, because it is complex. It is, as I said earlier, violent conflict is overdetermined, and you have to tackle these issues in a holistic perspective. Agenda 2030 is a major step forward, maybe not enough, but it has developed these 17 sustainable development goals, which focuses on the issues of peace building, governance, and institutional building with the issues of environmental degradations. So in short, resolving the issues of violent conflict at the national level is, of course, not a replacement for effective climate adaptation. But the climate action cannot function without safe environment where functioning governance structure could lead to more resilience of or actually to address structural sources of vulnerability. I mean, we all remember what the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan said, that you cannot have peace without sustainable development and no development without peace. So again, it is a complex issue that has to be dealt with internationally and nationally, but not in a silo mentality and not from an individual perspective to resolve this problem.
Thank you, Younes. Natasha?
I can answer, I think, to the other question, the one about the indicators. And I think in the line of work, I mean, what we're doing in the issue of, the water for peace, I think we've come across the challenge that we need to also define what we mean by peace. So is it just the absence of armed conflict, or is it more within the broader issue that I think, Younes touched upon, but we haven't really delved into, which is the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we are talking about, that piece, which is the piece with the prevalence of sustainable development, then I think the indicators that we will be using will be completely different than the ones that we would use if our definition of peace is only, the absence of armed conflict. And so as a first step, I think we need to agree on what is our definition of peace. And on the, at the second level, I think more recently, CIPRI has actually launched at the Stockholm 50+ their, report, Environment of Peace, where they have actually, raised this whole issue of how we could, moving forward, look at, both the peace and the environment as an intertwined direction. I think the issue of how we proceed with this, it's been rolling, and it would be interesting to be able to see what kind of indicators, generic ones, apply, generally, and which ones, we would have to apply within the specific context of a particular country or a particular region.
Okay, thank you, Natasha. I would like to give also Wim the opportunity to answer about the environmental monitoring and this question that keeps coming back about the protection of civilians. And there is here a question about the additional protocol from Guillermina, the additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions on the protection of victims of international armed conflicts deals specifically with the protection of the environment and water in times of international armed conflicts. How is it possible to strengthen these obligations during wars? And here, I think the three of you can answer, maybe Wim, Younes, and Natasha, and we'll take another round of questions as well. Thank you.
Yeah, again, two great questions. And I think when it comes to protection of civilians, it's really important. It's a top subject that's been getting growing recognition over the last decade, also through the UN Security Council. And we're trying to engage over these last couple of years through this UN Security Council reports on protection of civilians to highlight also how protection of the environment links with protection of civilians. So it comes to state responsibility for military actions, the impacts of military actions, for example, looking at targeting procedures like, do you target oil refinery or not? Do you share information on your operations to make sure that the post-conflict cleanup can be sped up? And yeah, basically highlighting also what the consequences are for environmental destruction in warfare on long-term recovery, because often we see also if that can be a source for, in particular, destruction of natural resources can be another source of conflict if that's not being resolved in a post-conflict situation, or the natural resources itself can be a source of conflict as prior to the full outbreak of a war. And that has implications, of course, for civilians. So highlighting that in those kind of discussions in UN Security Council also brings together showing how the environment is not something that's confined only to specific UN mandates. So, for example, there are discussions there have been resolutions in the UN Environment Assembly, particularly on protection of the environment and on conflict pollution. But in our experience, it's very siloed. So we talk about the environment in UN Environment Assembly, we talk about security in Security Council. But I think what we're trying to demonstrate over the last couple of years is how the interconnectedness of these issues, and you cannot see the one without the other. So if no one's addressing the environment in either the military responsibility of what they target, or if there's no inclusion of environmental recovery for acute or for long-term issues in post-conflict funding, for example, through the World Bank, through the IMF, through supporting national actors on inclusion of environment in remediation efforts and reconstruction and green recovery, then it doesn't function well. So I think what we need is a more of an umbrella approach, where this is being addressed throughout the UN system. And that's what I mentioned with the UN, the Environment, Peace and Security Agenda. It should not be addressed only one thing, but it should be mainstream throughout the UN work throughout the cycle of conflicts. So I think that's linked with the protection of civilians agenda as well. Like it is in the interest of protection of civilians to look at the environmental dimensions. Now, that might not always be super priority, but at least when it is a priority, then we know it, and that's where the monitoring comes in. So if we can see, okay, this is an acute issue, like most of the environmental issues, I can agree, you can take some more time to deal with that in the aftermath, but there are also issues which need acutely be addressed because of the risk to civilians. On the protocol, strengthening these obligations, that comes back to strengthening those norms. I think that's why it's important the work that the ICRC has been doing on the updated military guidelines on protection of the environment, building stronger norms, making states accountable for targeting decisions, and also non-state armed groups, hopefully through the work by I think the Geneva Call is working that a lot. And to visualize what this means. And also we can see that in for example, in Ukraine, like how the destruction of environment of water infrastructure impacts people and hold states accountable for those implications. But I think Natasha is in a better position to speak a bit more better on the water side of that, but how to strengthen these obligations. But I think, those are very important things to move forward.
Okay, thank you, Wim. Just for time, we have 15 minutes left on in our webinar. We'll give the floor to Natasha and Yunus, but also take the last two questions from Morocco, Osman. So here to Natasha, is your organization ready to cooperate in order to open a public debate in North Africa on water and peace, specifically in oasis areas? And the other question is, how can civil society unite, specifically in North Africa and Middle East, in order to reduce wars and transform conflicts through mediation if politicians adopt violence, kill innocents, and destroy what is left of the planet's environment? So maybe here the three of you, but we'll start with Natasha, then Yunus, and then Wim. Natasha?
Yeah. Well, part of our work is in the WANA region. And basically, in all of the regions where we intervene, we are actually, working towards the promotion of the use of water for peace. So I don't know, Othman, which organization you're representing, or are you representing the civil society? But definitely, we are open to having discussions, with partners that are interested in the topic. On the issue of the civil society, and I'll speak from the experience, that we have with the Global Observatory. And I think that it is very clear that in order to be able to drive global agendas, or to be able to have a change, towards the approach in the global agendas, and then there is a very clear role for the local communities, including the civil society. In the work that we have done with the Global Observatory, we have, basically discussions and reflections and even recommendations that are coming, from ground organizations and ground communities, which have highlighted entry points that probably at the global level and the regional level, we were not able to foresee. And so there is a huge role for the civil society, not just to work collectively with the civil society, but also to be able, to work with national and regional partners to bring about a change, both in the approach to the issues of water and peace, or environment of peace, but also to the implementation of recommendations that are made by the local communities, and to be able to take them up, from the national to the global level.
Thank you, Natasha. Yunus?
Regarding the first question on protection of civilians, I agree with my colleague Wim, and I would say that this issue has been, on the agenda of debates for at least the 2 decades, and the R2P principle, responsibility to protect, and the political controversy that this has created in many countries. So we have to take it with a grain of salt. And unfortunately, it always begs the question, who is in charge of this? Is it the state? Is it the international community? Who is the implementing actor in this? And while I agree that this is a major issue, it is still very politically sensitive. And then under which chapter of the Charter this intervention to protect civilians occurs? We've seen what happened with the intervention in Libya recently, and then the discussion that this has created is especially that the intervention and the mission of the UN in Libya has been a light footprint one. It was an advisory, not a peacekeeping, hard peacekeeping mission. So this is a long debate. It could be a webinar just for this. But yes, for the protection of civilians, and yes, for the integration of protection of environment more and more in the work of peacekeeping and other interventions. I understand that there are now guidelines by the ICRC and by other institutions on how to protect environment during violent conflict. Regarding the issue of mediation that the audience asked, this is of course the main mechanism to help resolve violent conflict and mitigate their impact. And within the UN system, one of the principles of effective mediation has always been local ownership. It is an important one. I'm not saying that this always happens, because we live in a political world with international competition, different perspective, different interests. But the local ownership remains the main, for me, as I have seen in my different experiences around the world working on issues of mediation. It is key, because at the end of the day, the international actors will leave the country, and those who will live with the consequences of any peace agreement are the people. So if they are not real actors effectively engaged and included in any peace negotiations, these will not be a durable peace and sustainable peace. And there are many examples around the world of failed peace agreements because the local perspective has never been fully taken into account. So yes, this part of mediation should be developed more. And at the end of the day, it's the people who live under this conflict who should be the ones to have their voices in its settlement.
Thank you, Yunus. Vim, would you like to also respond around, mediation and the role of international? We mentioned responsibility to protect, but again, how can your data be used in such contexts, internationally and regionally?
Yeah, I think that's the big challenge. I think because the environmental impacts are so multifaceted. You can start ranging from like dealing with mine action to humanitarian response to industrial issues, and the question is like there's no mechanism, international mechanism to deal with environmental damage. Only if states or donors feel like it's in their interest to or it's a priority for them to address this, they will donate funding to deal with that. But I think we should be looking towards a more established framework with an international funds there, where funding is available for dealing with acute cleanup and remediation efforts in terms of responding and remediation, so that money is always available to deal with that in post-conflict situations. And make sure this is also what I mentioned earlier, it's part of any reconstruction funding going to a country, that the environment is incorporated in that. So there will be capacity building for the environmental ministries, that there will always be an post-conflict environmental assessment done, an independent one. I think and here's also the role of civil societies and to be involved in this kind of process, to be a structural partner in these kind of response work, both international and national civil society. So you see, for example, in Ukraine, a lot of environmental organizations in Ukraine are really doing great work in documenting this. They've been really essential in bringing in like local incidence mapping in Ukraine. Similar thing I've mentioned in Syria. We have great partners at the moment in Iraq who are doing amazing work on also often on the risk of being persecuted. So environmental defenders also in conflict areas are facing harsh prosecution. So their voices are essential in this debate. So like we have to set up some kind of collaboration platform. I think also independently from governments. Going back to the question from the other proposal, where civil society organizations can share experiences, because there are, I think, a lot of similarities around environmental issues in conflict-affected areas. We can see, for example, the huge solid waste crisis throughout the Middle Eastern region. And of course, that has different causes, but like I think also in terms of dealing with solutions, there are a lot of stuff we can learn from each other there. There's also a great focus at the moment on green recovery, focus on nature-based solutions in conflict-affected areas. I think those are all opportunities we need to explore, not just to point out where the problem is, but also where the solution is for dealing with the conflict-linked environmental damage. And also lastly on accountability. So those who are responsible, particular states, for massive destruction that leads to environmental degradation, that they are being held accountable. And that's of course more difficult under international law because the threshold for accountability is really high. But like we have to find ways where at least states take more responsibility for that, or can be held accountable. And then we can think about solutions on solving that. But I think, how that should look like in terms of an international mechanism, it's going to be difficult. I think we have to take like a sort of piecemeal approach for each sector to establish those kind of principles. But I think that's hopefully work to be done, and then we'd likely collaborate with people on thinking and brainstorming about this. And lastly, like very happy for our Reform Initiative for leading this, in particular in the Middle East region.
Thank you, Wim. I think we've almost reached the end of our webinar. One more time, I'd like to thank you, Natasha, Karmi, Yunus Abouyub, and Wim for being with us and for sharing your own experiences, and also for engaging with a very open audience. This is what we as the Arab Reform Initiative and our environmental politics program with our partner from the Robert Bush Stiftung and Orient Matters, we open dialogues to understand more about how do we document peace, or how do we document conflict and its impact on the environment, what can be the role of international community and international organizations in really giving voices as well to the local actors. So please stay tuned with us. We have actually an international conference that will take place in person and in a hybrid format in Beirut at the end of January 31st and February 1st on conflict and how conflict and armed conflict is affecting the environment. It's a 2-day conference with speakers from all over the region and also from international. You would see again Vim, Natasha, and Yunus in person here in Beirut, but you can join us online. So again, one more time, thank you so much. And I'd like to thank our colleagues at the Robert Bosch Stiftung and Orient Matters, and also our dear colleagues within the initiative, Andrew and Camille, for their support in putting this webinar together. Thank you so much, everyone, and whoever is in the audience. Shukran. Bye-bye.
Thank you.